Del ciclo titulado Gobierno Corporativo en la Era de la Reestructuración del Capital, impartida por el profesor Thomas Clark, profesor investigador de la Universidad Tecnológica de Sydney. Good morning, everyone. We would like to thank you for joining us at the opening session of the lecture series Corporate Governance in the Area of Capital Restructuring, delivered by Professor Thomas Clark, researcher at the University of Technology, Sydney. Este ciclo es resultado del esfuerzo conjunto realizado desde el Área de Relaciones Productivas en México, el Departamento de Economía y el Posgrado en Economía de la FES Acatlán. This series is the result of a joint effort between the Economics Department at UAM Azcapotzalco and the Graduate Program in Economics at UNAM. Sin más, permítanme presentar al presidium que el día de hoy nos acompaña. Without further, allow me to introduce you the members of the Presidium accompanying us today. Primero, el doctor Jaime Alberto Prudencio, jefe del Departamento de Economía. Doctor Jaime Alberto Prudencio, Head of the Economics Department at UAM Azcapotzalco. El doctor Jorge Alonso Bustamante Torres, jefe de la División de Ciencias Socioeconómicas de la FES Acatlán, UNAM. El doctor Francisco Antonio Martínez, profesor investigador del Departamento de Economía, quien comentará la ponencia del profesor Clark. And I wanna, I just wanna, first in Spanish. Quiero pedirle al doctor Jaime Prudencio que nos ofrezca unas palabras de apertura. Let me ask to Dr. Jaime Prudencio give us a little comment to open this session.
Gracias, doctora Aloma. Muy buenos días a todos y todas. Voy a tratar de ser muy breve. Nos da mucho gusto que estén todos y todas aquí en esta serie de conferencias que se han organizado de forma conjunta entre el Departamento de Economía de la UAM Azcapotzalco y la FES Acatlán a través de su posgrado y del director de la División de Ciencias Socioeconómicas, el doctor Jorge Martínez, perdón, el doctor Jorge Bustamante. Es que tenemos Martínez. Quiero agradecer también a los organizadores de casa, a la doctora Paloma Sánchez Cruz, al doctor Francisco Martínez y está por llegar el doctor Andrés Godínez Enciso. Es para nosotros un gusto recibir al profesor Thomas Clark. Él es una figura internacionalmente reconocida en los estudios sobre el gobierno corporativo. Su trayectoria ha sido fundamental para comprender la evolución de los mecanismos de control, supervisión y responsabilidad dentro de las empresas. Chicos y chicas que estén en el área de concentración de economía de innovación, empresas, redes y territorio, esta parte del análisis del gobierno corporativo, del papel de las transnacionales y de la forma en que éstas se gobiernan a sí mismas y se relacionan entre sí en un mundo globalizado que está transformándose es fundamental. Por eso estoy muy contento que desde el área de relaciones productivas, a través de los profesores que he comentado, tenemos la oportunidad de escuchar a un especialista los puntos de vista más relevantes con esta primera de dos conferencias que tenemos aquí en la UAM Azcapotzalco. La siguiente la tendremos mañana en la FES Acatlán. Professor Clark, thank you very much to be here with us today. We truly appreciate your time and the opportunity to learn from your work. Sean todos y todas bienvenidas y les agradezco de nuevo a los organizadores y aprovechen esta conferencia que es por supuesto organizada por ustedes, chicos y chicas. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Me voy a permitir leer un poco acerca de la trayectoria del doctor Clark. El doctor es un experto internacional en gobierno corporativo y sostenibilidad. Además, es miembro vitalicio de la Royal Society of Arts. Es el primer académico, Sir Adrian Cadbury, de la International Corporate Governance Network, que representa fondos de inversionistas institucionales y está comprometida con la creación de valor sostenible. Ha publicado obras fundamentales en gobernanza y sostenibilidad. Recientemente publicó la tercera edición de su influyente libro, Gobernanza Corporativa Internacional, con Routledge en 2024, con un prólogo de Sir Adrian Cadbury, ex miembro del directorio del Banco de Inglaterra y presidente y director ejecutivo de Cadbury Schweppes y rector de la Universidad de Aston. Estoy recortando mucho. Sus intereses actuales de investigación se centran en los aspectos de la empresa sostenible, incluidas metas y medidas de sostenibilidad, gobernanza de proyectos, políticas y estrategias corporativas para emisiones neta cero, economía circular y regenerativa. Sus intereses también de investigación, los complementarios incluyen la transformación hacia la economía digital, la inteligencia artificial, la robótica, el papel de las corporaciones, de plataformas digitales y la innovación hacia la economía del conocimiento. Ha publicado un total de 35 libros, 70 capítulos de libros y 69 artículos en revistas académicas. Bueno, y el CV del profesor es muy largo y muy interesante y no voy a tomar más tiempo. The format for today's session is as follows. Professor Clark will have 40 minutes for his presentation. And then Professor Martinez, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes? So,
Yes.
to make your
Maybe 10.
your commentary. Okay. And then we have maybe 50 minutes to hear your questions. Please be free to make this. No? Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here in Mexico City, and thank you very much, Palermo, for organizing this very impressive session. I'm privileged to be addressing a group of economists. I cannot claim to be an economist myself. I perhaps am a little of a political economist, but I managed to remember this morning that I did do a similar presentation to this some years ago in Seattle University in America. And sitting right in front of me was Oliver Hart, who's a very famous Nobel Prize winner in economics. And he seemed to be listening to me. And subsequently, he did write a more critical article than I'd known from his work before. So perhaps what I have to say might be of some relevance to economists too. Are we doing simultaneous translation, or are people okay with English?
No.
Yeah. Well, I do apologize that my Spanish is non-existent, despite the fact that I have a Spanish-speaking partner who speaks perfect English. Right. So, look, I thought firstly I'd go through my biography a little because it does explain about who we are and why we think as we do. So I was born in the north of England, in Liverpool. Remember the Beatles? And it was an area of the 19th century industrial revolution, but that had all gone. Everything was closed when I was a young kid. And I was wondering, where will we work? What will we do? And that was a question that's certainly concentrated in my mind for a long time, certainly when I was in England. I became an academic, and I've actually worked in all of the continents, including South America, and now I live in Australia. But I've seen in each of those continents the struggles there are to reclaim a new economy and to build a better future, particularly in an era of climate change. And I think that's touched all of my work. So what I was going to do firstly is run through some of the work I've done in the form of books. I like books very much. I feel that they are a fine aesthetic form. Now, I get into trouble with my colleagues for this because they believe in the academic journal article as the route to authenticity in the profession. And I can see the point of that, and I do some articles. But academic journals tend to only be read by other academics, whereas books can be read by the general public and indeed the world. And that's really my audience, I hope. So let's see what you think of it. How do I switch the screen? Oh, it's on. Oh, so there's one of, this is just a selection of my works, but this is rethinking the company. So this is really what I've been doing all my life, starting back there where, deindustrialization had eliminated the relics of the Industrial Revolution in the UK. But for other reasons than just deindustrialization, the company had to be rethought. And I became a member of the Royal Society of Art's Tomorrow's Company Inquiry, which was funded by some major corporations to look at the sources of sustainable success in the mid-1990s in Britain. And this was something of a departure because British business people were very conservative and very backward looking, because that had been the greatness of Britain during, the 19th and early 20th century. But what I discovered was that the industrialists, at least, who were involved in this inquiry, the Tomorrow's Company inquiry, and this book that I drafted was really the foundation statement of that inquiry, Rethinking the Company. What I found was that these younger executives were interested in finding a new future for industry and in building a new economy and having new relationships. And I thought that was very inspiring at the time. However, I must admit that for some years prior to this, I'd been looking at something else, which was privatization, because one big movement in economics of industry was the arrival of Mrs. Thatcher. She was the Prime Minister of Britain, the woman with the hat on, and she determined that she was going to privatize Britain, and indeed, with Ronald Reagan's help, privatize the world. Just by the way, the man in the background, that's Clement Attlee. He was the Prime Minister who socialized the British economy. He rescued the hospitals and the social services. He introduced better education, better health services, and indeed helped to regenerate the industrial economy of Britain. But he did that through public means often, and Mrs. Thatcher did not like what had occurred. And so she started this revolution against the state sector, against the public sector, that over the 10 years of her prime ministership really largely succeeded in either getting rid of large parts of the public sector or indeed making them act and think like they were market-driven organizations, which she thought they should be. The guy in the middle is Tony Blair, who tried to sort out the mess after Thatcher. So in fact, the big wave of privatization occurred in the early 90s in Britain, but then became a worldwide phenomenon of driving markets through the economy and the society. And I actually did two books on this, but this is one of them, International Privatization, which was an examination of privatization throughout the world and was published by a German publisher. I brought this book to East Germany with a number of European colleagues there for a conference, and this Polish woman came up to me and she said, "How did you find the only two people in Poland who actually are critical of privatization," which I'd done. I knew I'd done that. But the whole book is actually critical of privatization. Why? Because it was a false remedy, and particularly in the context of Eastern Europe. If you won't remember, I remember a bit. I'm a bit older than you, but what happened was Gorbachev called for perestroika, restructuring of the economies, not only of Russia, but of all of the Eastern European states. And he wasn't going to dominate them anymore. He was going to let them free to run their own countries and their own economies. The absolute opposite of Putin, who wants to regain control of these Eastern European economies and is prepared to go to war to do so. But Gorbachev was the great enlightened leader of Russia and of perestroika. But unfortunately, this movement was captured by the Harvard economists. Floods of Harvard economists went over to Eastern Europe and said, all they've got to do is privatize all the public sector, and 90% of economic activity was in the public sector in these Eastern European countries. All they've got to do is privatize, and that's it. You know, you'll have miracle economies. And so they all privatized everything, you know, the commanding heights of their economy, and their economic output collapsed. And that lasted for nearly 10 years until they began to try to sort out the damage that the Harvard economists had done to their economies. By the late 90s, I was beginning to cheer up a bit, and I wrote this book, Changing Paradigms. You may have heard of the Russian economist Kondratiev. He said about the long waves of economic development, and then Schumpeter talked about creative destruction of the economy and how new industries form out of the old industries. And another American guy called Kuhn talked about paradigm shifts, the sudden ways in which suddenly economic and scientific revolutions occur. And I came up with changing paradigms, which is that it's not just the economy and it's not just technology, it's everything that changes. It's the way we think and act, it's our values, and it's all of the major institutions of the society. That is the law and directors' duties and every aspect of industry and the economy. And I thought that this book would have a huge influence, but it didn't. But it was actually, oh no, it's another one. I was going to say it was translated into a number of languages, but I've got the wrong book, I think. It was this book that was translated into lots of languages. So the Rethinking the Company one was translated into Spanish, also Chinese, and a number of other languages. And that was the more optimistic work that I did in the early 1990s. And this work was a lot more kind of critical, but also more utopian. And it didn't actually have as much influence, I think. I became then very much a scholar of corporate governance because I thought that that was the essential vehicle that needed to change in order to change everything else in the economy. That is, if directors thought their duty was simply to deliver the maximization of shareholder value for the owners of the company, and that was it, and many directors felt like that in the Western economies at least, and the Western economists from Harvard University and Chicago Business School stressed that this was the one and only approach, and I'm discussing that later. But if that was the sole discipline of directors' duties in developing and driving their companies, I thought that was something of a problem, and wanted to explore wider theories of governance and how the company could be run for a variety of interests, the interests of the customers and the employees and the community and of the country, in a broader conception of directors' duties. I subsequently wrote a big book on international corporate governance and covered the world, all the continents. And this book has gone through many editions. And Sir Adrian Cadbury, who was then the guy who drafted the British corporate governance principles and subsequently worked at the OECD in Paris with others to draft the international corporate governance principles, he wrote the substantial forwards to this book and to others that I did. I haven't just done governance though, and I was delighted to work some decades later with Kuan Lee, who was the president of the International Schumpeter Society. Remember, Schumpeter was the guy who did the creative destruction, and he's a Korean intellectual. And of course, by now, that is by the early 2000s and into the 2020s, the place in the world, perhaps besides Mexico, were really exciting things were happening in the industrial economy was in Asia, and specifically China and East Asia, clearly Japan, but subsequently Korea and the other economies. And Kuan Lee introduced, who I edited this book with, introduced the idea of fast cycle innovation, where you could actually leapfrog through. He's been working on this for decades, how you achieve fast cycle innovation. And I've just been reading the last few days how the Chinese economy has achieved it with solar and other digital technologies, and now dominating the world economy with those solar technologies, because they were so committed to achieving this, and they have done so. And I know that here in Mexico, you're working at trying to advance in a number of industries too, rapidly. This was the Oxford Handbook of the Corporation. So Oxford University, I think, it claims to be one of the oldest universities in the world and has the oldest press. And I was very pleased to do this, which I thought was an authoritative statement of where we were at and where we were going. But a few years later, I did this book, which stressed the centrality of crises to economic change, and how out of those crises, those cycles of crises, well, in fact, I put it the wrong way around. The cycle of innovation does inevitably, sadly, lead to crises, and out of those crises, we have to build reforms to sustain the innovation capacity. And this ship at sea was a sort of manifestation of, the kind of crisis that the global economy was in as global value chains began to be threatened, and of course now threatened very much more deliberately by Donald Trump. And this is the last book I've done, and it's not yet out. It's out in a couple of months, but in many ways it's an edited work, but it's amongst the books that I'm most pleased with. And it's because I believe that sustainability has become the central problem of industrial economies, indeed of the whole world. And I like the cover of this book. When I proposed this picture, the publisher said to me, "But what's that got to do with sustainability? What's she got to do with sustainability?" But I said, "Look, she's in her schoolhouse, and she has no electricity, mud floors, mud walls, lives on a few grains, little meat a day. Her contribution to global warming is zero or below zero, and we have got to learn from the peoples of the world who are living sustainable lives. And firstly, we've got to learn to live sustainable lives ourselves, but also we've got to stop the climate change that will undermine their capacity to live sustainable existences." Right, so that was an introduction to the broad sweep of my work, and I was going to turn more specifically to some of the detail of what I do, but perhaps I should pause in case anyone wants to make a comment or ask a question.
Well,
¿Alguna pregunta? Not yet.
Not yet.
They want to see the whole.
Okay, so this is the serious stuff, and the serious stuff is, what is the purpose of the corporation? Now, as economists, I'm sure you're very hard-headed about it, and it's about making goods and providing services, but you have to define purpose in more explicit terms than that. And here we've got some philosophical statements about the purpose of the corporation is a company's fundamental reason for existing. And I began to become increasingly interested in the process of value creation, because that's what economic enterprises are supposed to do, aren't they? They're supposed to create value. But unfortunately, too many of our corporations for too long in history have translated that into making money. You know, the purpose of the corporation is to make as much money as possible, as quickly as possible, and not to worry about what the consequences might be. And the consequences have, of course, been pollution, poverty, inequality, often products that are harmful to people. So we have to look more critically at the purpose of the corporation than we might instinctively wish to do so at first. So in this very brief talk now, I was going to talk about the purpose of the corporation, critique shareholder value, which has been a sort of guiding value of corporate behavior and directors' duties, largely due to a group of very influential US economists over the last few decades. Look at the process of financialization, where financial institutions have an inordinate power. A look at the license to operate of corporations, what gives them a license, and reconceptualizing business purpose. So the big ideas, I deal with the big ideas, and I let more scientific brains than mine deal with the implementation. So we return to Mrs. Thatcher. You probably are young enough not to know anything about Mrs. Thatcher, but in many ways she was a lot worse than Donald Trump. I mean, she was a really frightening woman. And there's her outside the house, the 10 Downing Street, where the Prime Minister lives, giving a Hitler salute to the people. And her big thing was Tina. So Tina is, there is no alternative. And of course, there is no alternative to her will and to what she wants and to her values. And that's a terrible thing to have in a prime minister. In case I forget to say it later, the whole world admires your current president, who seems to have an intelligence and a balance and a capability, a competence, which is rare in politicians to have all of them. So I think you're very lucky to have your current president. And fortunately, she's not at all like Mrs. Thatcher. On to stakeholder theory. So I regarded stakeholder theory as the critique of Thatcherism and everything Thatcherism stood for. And I actually edited this edition of Long Range Planning more than 25 years ago now, to elaborate on what the stakeholder corporation and stakeholder theory was about. And some of these people were among the better people who were critical of shareholder value thinking, including Margaret Blur, who's an American lawyer who, with her colleague Lynn Stout, elaborated a theory of team production in business, which is a rather more amenable theory of how industry is managed than the maximization of shareholder value theory does. Just interestingly, that this guy David Wheeler, can you see that David Wheeler? He founded the Body Shop with Anita Roddick, which was the first company that was providing soaps and cosmetics that didn't use harmful chemicals or animal testing. And he subsequently went on to be a professor of sustainability and then a university vice chancellor. But now he's retired to the jungle of Costa Rica, and that's where I'm going next week to see him. So the purpose of the corporation. Now, I got interested in this a few years ago because suddenly big business in America seemed to abandon conceptually maximization of shareholder value, and I'll say a little more about that in a few moments. But this guy, the CEO of BlackRock, one of the biggest investment institutions, sort of led the charge towards investigating a new purpose for the corporation, and wanting to recreate more responsible corporations committed to a wider group of stakeholders. And that was taken up by lots of glamorous and extremely rich business people in America, including this guy, Jamie Dimon, the chair of JP Morgan. And it seemed to be a new willingness to be part of a community, which took me by surprise, because the tradition for American big business was to be very hard-faced about business realities, being about, you know, the hard financials. So the US Business Roundtable redefined the purpose of the corporation to promote an economy that serves all Americans, which took a lot of people by surprise. And they issued various documents of statements of principle, and these are the people, you know, the guy who runs Apple, and Amazon, and the others. And one reason why they might have wanted to change the at least public perception of what American corporations are about is that the rest of the world had been very much more explicit and committed to environmental and social and governance principles. And this is just one survey showing that the Europeans and the Asian economies were much more alert to the importance of environmental, social, and governance issues being disciplining factors in enterprise. So all of this was a critique of the doctrine of shareholder value. Now, you're young enough not to have been afflicted by this doctrine, but when I was a young person, I was. You know, I was idealistic. I believed in justice and in equity and, you know, fine principles. And then this guy came along in the 1970s, Milton Friedman. The social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. And you wouldn't believe it, with a crude and silly doctrine like that, he conquered the world. He conquered America, certainly. He was hosted in Hollywood as the best economist in the world. And it was such a crass and silly theory that he managed to impose on the business schools, the economic schools, certainly of North America, but indeed influentially through the journals and so on much of the rest of the world. And this is actually the root of it. His article in the New York Times that said the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. And he said this about an AGM, an annual general meeting of the General Motors, which then was the leading corporation of America. And at that AGM, a number of shareholders who were representatives of significant social groups, the community, the health service, shareholders groups, said that they wanted to see a new direction of the company to represent the public interest. And they wanted to look more specifically at the performance of the company in areas of safety and pollution in the vehicles that they made. Now, these were very, you know, noble, important principles that the car industry had to respect. The car industry was polluting the world, and it was a dangerous industry at the time. I mean, you know, cars were not the safety conscious vehicles they are much more of today. So this is what Friedman termed socialism, and what he did was turn those major car companies, GM and Ford, away from a safety focus and an examination of environmental alternatives, the internal combustion engine, which they had started exploring, partly because the environmental laws had changed in California and elsewhere. And he actually, his thinking was what led GM to abandon its electric car project that was doing exceptionally well in the 70s and 80s. And he left the field open, or Friedman's doctrine left the field open to Tesla. Tesla was formed by two GM engineers who were disillusioned when GM halted its electrical engine development. And they recruited Elon Musk. And of course, we know what happened later. So initially, Tesla was a small player in the world car industry. It wasn't really due to Elon Musk. He will tell you the story that it was all him. It was engineers who were much more grounded than he ever was, and money seems to be his main inclination. $1 trillion now is his current wage. Not bad money if you can get it. And that's what happened to Tesla's share price, which is why he's able to claim so much money for the work he actually never did. And of course, it drove all of the car companies in America and around the world in an electric direction, which of course the Asian companies, particularly the Chinese companies, have led in. And which is, of course, of great significance to the Mexican economy too. So we turn to the license to operate, and there was some worry that actually US corporations had become so misguided that they were actually failing because the number of US corporations was reducing quite radically. But in fact, this wasn't a failure. This was part of the financially driven merger and takeover. So it was just that the number of companies were reducing because there was consolidation, takeovers, which are often financially driven takeovers. And although the number of corporations has diminished in the United States, the economic might of these corporations has continued in a fairly unregulated way. Can we conceptualize business purpose? The sustainable development goals of the United Nations and the World Business Council with sustainable development have given us a guidance, and for a while at least, 5 or 10 years, these were taken quite seriously, and some companies, European companies at least, were incorporating these principles into their annual reporting on each of these principles. But what we've always been worried about is to what extent is this genuine change and important redirection, and to what extent is it simply greenwashing, or in this case, purpose washing. Actually, problems with corporations remain, that their regulation, their refusal to accept regulation, directors still having narrow views, their refusal to pay tax, even though they use public facilities, the extraordinary scale of executive bonuses, what they're doing down global supply chains, which is often very irresponsible with reference to working conditions and the production of goods and services that have questionable health and safety. And then most of all, the environmental commitments to zero emissions. And just in case I don't get a moment to mention it, of course, it's the digital solutions to pollution that we're really exploring now most seriously as an aid to systemically reducing our emissions, But the companies that are delivering on this are setting up the vastest data centers in the world that are consuming huge amounts of electricity and polluting the atmosphere. So instead of the big techs saving the world, you know, they could be contributing also to our demise. So we have to be somewhat skeptical about these leaders who are compromised in important ways. And we have to realize the importance of the broad changing paradigms that are required to achieve true and lasting change, which involve international policies, involve multiple hundreds of business and civil society initiatives, the work of the sustainability indices, new conceptions of fiduciary duty to create businesses committed to sustainable value production. All the companies say they're doing it. They all say they're heading for zero emissions. That is, all of the leading technologically based companies, certainly in Europe, but in the US too. But you have to examine what they're actually doing. And what they're actually doing is fudging the figures. So they're appearing to pledge the move to zero emissions, but in reality, they're missing out their supply chains, and they are refusing to accept responsibility for emissions that ultimately they are in fact responsible for. So we need to pivot from shareholder value to sustainable value, and that's happening now. And I've got a good friend who's an Italian accountant who's doing brilliant work on this with regard to the performance measures for sustainable value creation. But it's happening in terms of corporate conceptions and practices, advances in theory, developments in national policy and international policy, despite the disappointment of the COP in Brazil currently. New strategies and practices and new programs, new performance measures leading to sustainable value creation. Now, I define corporate governance now as the delivery of sustainable value creation. And I think I'll leave us with that. We need system change, not climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Vamos a darle la palabra al profesor Francisco Martínez para que haga sus comentarios.
Okay, gracias. Okay, thank you for the invitation for this second time to discuss the work of some important economists. And I must confess that I didn't know the work of Professor Clark before. I just
a lot of people don't.
I will tell you why this is important, because I mean my specialty or my topics that I focus on basically are macroeconomics, you know, exchange rates, interest rates, wages, and so on and so forth. And my perspective, my approach is the post-Keynesian approach. And you know, this is the big picture of how the countries, the companies behave, more or less. And I think that is, for me, really, it's a compliment to see in a different way. I mean, how once we discuss macroeconomics, how we translate this perspective and ideas to the companies, you know, how they have to behave now. According to me, and as this is what I want to say, try to understand your work, because I just had a glance to check quickly your work, and for me is a new awareness of how these companies, I mean, not only international companies, but also Mexican, I mean, national companies should behave. No, it's not only like Professor Plan mentioned, to maximize profits. And then we have to ask profit for what? No, for who? No, I mean, now, especially I was reading yesterday some book, one of the book Professor Clark, and he was mentioning that we have now new constraints. Mostly the basic constraint that we are suffering right now is basically no. We have to change our perspective now, not only to think about just maximizing or increasing profit for CEOs and all of them for the stakeholders. Okay, so I mean, that's correct. I mean, I like this approach. I see this approach like a complement for me for the post-initial macro perspective. But I have one question to Professor Clark, and this question is how or who could impose or to enforce this new approach to the companies? Is it the UN? Is it the local authorities? I mean, the government, the municipalities. Should be this new approach, your approach that you are proposing, should be this in the constitution, for example, to be enforced. I don't know if you have discussed this in another work, because this is important. I mean, we have constraints, yes, we have constraints, especially now the environment constraints is the most important constraint. But also the other question, because now you know that we are, for example, Mexico is competing with Canada, with the United States, and also with the European countries. And my concern with this approach is that now these countries could force us to take this new way of thinking in order to export, for example, to other countries. If we don't follow or we don't show that we are following this new perspective, they can restrict our export, for example. I mean, this is like a disadvantage for some countries that they don't have the development, the adequate development yet to change the perspective, to change the new thinking that you are proposing. I mean, you don't see this like a new disadvantage for developing countries. You know, you mentioned before that you had some experience in Latin America, for example. I don't know the case of Brazil, for example, or other countries alike. And yeah, I mean, I would like to start with this, and then probably you answer this. Maybe I can pose other questions.
Yes, they're very interesting questions, and it's challenging when you're a developing economy or a transitional economy, and you want to achieve important economic progress, and the pressures are to do it in an entirely conventional way. And it seems perhaps more risky to look at alternative technologies and forms of energy and so forth. But I've been reading the last few days how China has just absolutely seized the world market in car batteries and other batteries. Actually, I know this personally because I was betraying my principles. I was determined to buy a Tesla battery for the house, for the house electricity. And the guy that was selling me it said, "Look, go with the Chinese one. It's better." He said, "We have less faults with the Chinese one." So I switched to the Chinese one. So I'm buying a Chinese house battery now. And that obviously we would not wish to adopt the Chinese political system that's enforced that change in economic and technological direction. But the reality is that Trump is committing his economy, the U.S. economy, to a 19th century, early 20th century, rapidly becoming redundant, fuel, and China has committed itself to the 21st century economy, and is in, going to be in such a strong, so much stronger position as a result. It's not just China, though. My colleague Kuan Lee, who did the fast cycle innovation book, the Korean economy has done very well from adopting those kinds of innovative principles, and so can other industrial economies, including Mexico. I think Mexico is on a cusp where it could, just commit to generating wealth in very conventional ways, or it could actually, become one of the alternative, more innovative economies for the future. And I think there's a lot of promise in that. I'm sorry, I drifted off. I'm trying to answer your question, but thank you.
Si tienen alguna pregunta, por favor, adelante.
Yes. Thinking about the Chinese side.
Yeah.
Some people think that there are two paradigms in the world. The Chinese paradigm, or the economic Chinese paradigm, and the American Chinese paradigm.
Yeah.
Do you think that one of these will be the winner for the future? Which one?
I think I've implied that, actually my views have changed in recent months and weeks, because of this ascendancy that the Chinese now have got in both the car batteries and the domestic batteries. And they've just leapfrogged. My friend Cohen Lee talked about leapfrogging in fast cycle innovation, but they've just and how on earth a failed businessman, Donald Trump, could be leading the US economy down the back alley of atavistic, that means looking towards the past, technologies, when the promise of the newer technologies in energy is so great, and the Biden administration committed the economy to that, and he has reversed it, and the reason he's reversed it is for the fast buck. We're talking about a few fast trillions of dollars. It does pollute the world, and the damage done to the world is probably a great deal more than a few $1 trillion. But it's money in your hand, and that's what Donald Trump understands. The Chinese are building an economy for generations to come, and Trump's building an economy for his rich friends now and himself.
Yeah.
Mm.
Thank you.
¿Alguna pregunta, chicos? ¿En español o en...?
I'm trying to read English.
Okay.
Thank you.
Once you mentioned the purpose washing,
Mm.
I thought immediately about the tech companies.
The what companies?
Tech
yeah.
technology companies,
Yeah.
such as Microsoft.
Yeah.
They've been thinking about Latin American countries such as Mexico and Chile, Uruguay, to build all these data centers. And here in Mexico, I thought they have over 10 data centers. One of the most controversial is one in the state of Querétaro, and they are it's great, all the tech advance that they are the all this purpose that they have. But the other side of all this thing is that they are taking and they are provoking a great damage in the environment. They are now taking enough amount of water to give to 50,000 families. They can do anything, and I wonder what can we do as a society to report that. I don't know how they evaluate all these projects to can do it in the country, because they estimate that they have their purposes, that like they don't have they are not making a bad use of all these natural resources that are of the people that live there. But it seems that we can do anything. So I wonder, what can we do? How can we report, or what can we do to avoid that?
I think it's a very significant and important statement. And firstly, we have to understand that the digital solutions are very important for ending climate change and for building sustainable industries. They will be digitally based, but we cannot ignore the fact that the tools of the digital economy include or are centrally based on these vast data centers, which, as you've accurately portrayed, are using enormous amounts of electricity and water. They make imagine a train coming past all 24 hours a day. They make enormous amounts of noise. They're locating them near to centers of human population, and they're not going to help those populations live satisfying lives, but they're also locating them in parts of the world where there's already water shortages, and where there is already environmental damage, and they will contribute to that. So it's this awful dilemma we're in, that tech is now increasingly influencing the world economy, and tech portrays itself as being forward-looking and responsible and clean, and the reality is very different from that, as you portray.
Thank you very much for your conference, Professor Clark. And I have two ideas in mind. I saw a sort of collision between the large corporations' objectives and something like the sustainable development goals. Can a large corporation truly commit to this kind of goals if this call is profitability in question? I have a scandal in mind, the case of Volkswagen, when they lie about the emissions of their cars. That's the first question. And the second one is about your work. Have you studied the role of the
Financialization
in the behavior of the corporate firm? How these kind of topics change the behavior of the corporate? Thank you very much.
Right. Yeah, two important questions. The damage that the Volkswagen saga did to the brand was really quite terrible for the company, and of course they shunted themselves into electric cars with great commitment after that disaster they'd experienced. In terms of industrialists leading the sustainability crusade, the CEO of Unilever was attempting to do that, and I'd known Unilever all my life because I once got a sponsorship from them, and they were in my community. It's a conglomerate food and soap corporation, and this CEO and others like him were very strong in campaigning for sustainability, and we were actually given some funds to look at the claims and to analyze their veracity. And the reality is that these companies, even when they're really trying to be sustainable and to do the right thing, are caught in all kinds of contradictions, especially at the local level, where things are happening, the use of resources, the materials they're using, and so on, which simply shouldn't happen. So the global value chains are really problematic. That all companies, almost all companies, are engaged in, and also very problematic in terms of their use of labor. I had a young research assistant who kept going on at me about modern slavery, and he was annoying me. Modern slavery, and I didn't know it existed, not to the degree it does, but it does. Essentially millions of people throughout the world are in employment relationships that are not very different from slavery in terms of the degree of exploitation. So there's a lot of work to be done, and we cannot accept simple solutions, and we can't accept plausible arguments. we've got to investigate further. One of the interesting and inspiring things is that there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of agencies doing this work, investigating companies and revealing the data. And it's harder for companies to hide now. They still do, and sometimes successfully, but there is a light being shone on exploitation in global value chains and on pollution by companies that claim, including the banks, to turn to your second point, the banks have been claiming to be totally committed to sustainability for some years now, even decades, but in reality, almost all of them are still in fossil fuels, investing in fossil fuels. They're all compromised, and the leading commanding heights, the financial sector, are becoming more powerful all the time. My friend Bill Lazonic, who's actually funded by the billionaire whose name Soros, George Soros, he's been writing on the financialization of different sectors, but on pharmaceuticals and other critical sectors, that they're being driven by money, not by morality. And we saw that with OxyContin and other drugs in the United States that turned into awful vast numbers of casualties amongst the middle class of America.
Do you see a connection as in your study and your books between the UN US-led initiative for clean energy?
I don't think the UN and the US currently, at least, get on all that well. I don't think the UN and the US get on very well. Yeah. Yeah.
We have seen in the 2030 accords and all of this. Between that and Europe's deindustrialization, economic decline, loss of competitiveness, and I don't know, I can say maybe energy dependence and all this. I think we can see these changes in patterns, economic patterns in Europe. Do you see a connection between these initiatives and the situation in Europe right now?
I think you might have been influenced more by United States interpretations of Europe than Europe itself. Of course, the rate of economic growth is slower in Europe than in some other economies. But if you spend time in Europe, you know, there's a balance to life there. They have got viable industries and technologies, but they've also appreciated, you know, the beauty of the ecology. I spent some time in Norway just a few months ago, and it was like being in paradise. And it's not just that they've got mountains and lakes everywhere; it's that they're very scrupulous about waste. You know, they don't waste anything. Everything is cleaned up, and the value system of Europe, and indeed of many other countries in the world, is more balanced than the very market-driven societies who will despoil and destroy everything for money, and to make as much money as possible as fast as possible. It's an ethos that's ultimately, certainly it's personally and socially destructive, but it's ultimately economically destructive of the future resource base and potential of the economy and the society concerned. Yeah.
In that sense, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
What would be the role of the state
Yeah.
in this
sort of subduing the market and the market logic.
So not necessarily subduing, so encouraging the better instincts, but you do go on.
Yeah, it came to mind when I think that it's not only, and I think you put it well, I have the record word, but well, listen, it's not only internal or corporate, say, structure that prioritizes this shareholder logic. It's the whole market, I would say.
Not the customers.
The customers. So, what would be the role of the government, the state in this sense? How do you see it?
Well, there is a degree of schizophrenia. I mean, the Biden administration was committed to a wholly different set of strategic priorities to the Trump administration, and that's a bit confusing for everyone, including for Trump. Finding a future that is tolerable, sustainable, and socially supportive is not an easy task. It is a complex task, and I might have, in my naive simplicity, encouraged you to believe it's easier than it is. But it's something that can unite people. A healthier, cleaner, greener, more satisfying, more aesthetically balanced society. Materialism and consumption isn't necessarily the route to absolute happiness. We can have balanced societies in which we have quite sufficient without the excessive consumption that's been inculcated in us for generations now, and is both unnecessary and ultimately harmful to the planet and probably to us too. Yeah.
Well, prosperity was the same as the growth and consumption according to the classical theories, I would say. But I mean, what I want to ask you also again is this new awareness or new perspective to think it should be demanded by societies.
Yeah.
And I think probably the richer the society is, probably they will be demanding more these new policies, new perspectives to be enforced by the government, right, to the companies. This is what we are. To impose this new awareness, new policies to demand more justice, more these goals to the enterprises, so the international enterprises.
You are talking about distribution of income.
Yeah, but this is my second question. If there is this perspective that you are proposing, is there exists a new rule to share the value from, the profits from the companies, to make a fair share to the workers, to be more equitable the distribution of income? I don't know if you have talked, sorry, about this rule to share the value of the companies.
Well, that's ultimately an objective of an alternative system that I'm proposing. But but across Europe, there are countries that have achieved a much better balance between their economic priorities and their social commitments. And they're not as obsessed by materialism. They're they're committed to a high quality of life. It's the material things don't necessarily automatically produce a high quality of life. They can be part of a high quality of life. But in other parts of the world too, and including in, you would find, I would believe an alternative set of principles to the let's get rich quick, pollute everything and die before, and leave the consequences to our children. Just by the way, we're mixing a lot with industrialists. It's often their kids and often their daughters that have persuaded them to do something, to be a little bit more responsible. But I think there are attractive alternatives that can capture people's imagination. Looking back to Biden's program, Biden was trying to reclaim as much of America as he could, in the waterways and the national parks and the agriculture and stopping the fracking of oil and so on, and was enjoying quite a lot of success, including in the Republican states, who were very happy to accept the money to improve their roads and to improve their waterways and so on. And unfortunately, as soon as Trump got in, he stopped all of that funding, or tried his best to. As this young person is saying here, system change, not climate change. I think we can change systems. We don't have to simply live with what we've inherited. B, I think we can change them in ways that enhance the welfare of people and of our economic existence in terms of its certainty. We're not actually creating the conditions for our own downfall. Ultimately, I'm beginning to sound like a politician. I do believe that things can be made better, and I think pessimism is not helpful, and also the kind of naked self-interest which is propagated by right-wing politicians isn't a very useful way forward.
¿Preguntan, chicos? ¿Chicas? ¿No? Bueno, creo que estamos en tiempo. I think we are on time. I just want to thank to Professor Clark. We are very, very, very happy to see you here at
Thank you.
Acatlán, at UAM Azcapotzalco. Me van a correr, mi jefe. UAM Azcapotzalco. ¿Me podrías pasar, Gatlán, el verdecito, por favor? Si eres tan gentil.
Yeah, certificate.
Your certificate participation.
Oh,
Thank
terrific.
You,
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Present.
Oh, and a present too. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
I hope this will be the first of many visits in the future. Thank you very much. No.
No, it's splendid. It's wonderful to meet you. And good luck with your careers.
Muchas gracias. Pues, profesor, can we take a picture?
Oh, sure.
Uno, dos, tres. ¿Sí salimos
Muy
todos?
bien. A la una,
A las 2.
a las dos.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Tequila, a ver.
Sí,
Tequila.
pero
Una más con el otro.
con el tequila. Ah, no, pero con el otro celular.
Dice más tarde.
No me sale.
Una, dos. Ahora, midito. Ahora,
Saluden todos. Muchas gracias, José. Gracias.
All pleasure to have you.